Hello everyone, welcome to the Mysterious Stories channel, where you'll discover the most mysterious, scary, and fascinating stories. Make sure to turn up the volume and get ready for a spine-chilling experience you won't forget. Date: October 7, 1969. Location: a remote hill deep within the central highlands of Vietnam. Characters: Sergeant Tom Harrison, a seasoned leader with a haunted past. Private Jake Turner, a fresh recruit, eager but nervous. Corporal Steve Davis, a sharpshooter with a knack for sensing danger. Private First Class Mike Carter, quiet, observant, and deeply superstitious. Lieutenant Frank Roberts, the commanding officer, determined to complete the mission. The air was thick with the humidity of the Vietnamese jungle as Sergeant Tom Harrison led his squad up the steep, forested slope known as the Screaming Hill. The men were already exhausted, having trekked through the dense underbrush for hours, but the mission was critical. Intelligence had reported unusual enemy activity in the area, and their orders were to scout the hill and confirm the presence of the Viet Cong. From the moment they entered the vicinity of the hill, an eerie silence settled over the group. The usual sounds of the jungle chirping insects, distant bird calls, and the rustling of leaves were absent. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. "Stay sharp," Sergeant Harrison whispered, his voice barely audible as he scanned the surroundings. "Something doesn't feel right." Private Jake Turner, new to the unit and still adjusting to the realities of war, felt a cold sweat drip down his spine. The silence was oppressive, and he found himself gripping his rifle tighter, as if expecting something to jump out from the shadows at any moment. Corporal Steve Davis moved with the precision of a predator, his eyes constantly darting from one shadow to the next. He had been on countless patrols, but something about this place unsettled him. It wasn't just the silence. It was the feeling that they were being watched, followed even by something unseen. "Mike, you picking up anything?" Davis asked quietly, his voice low. Private First Class Mike Carter, known among the men for his uncanny sixth sense, paused for a moment, closing his eyes as if trying to feel the pulse of the jungle. When he opened them again, there was a look of concern on his face. "I don't like this, Sarge," Carter muttered. "It feels wrong, like we're not supposed to be here." Lieutenant Frank Roberts, leading from the front as always, turned to address the squad. "We have our orders. Men, stay focused. We'll be in and out before you know it." Despite Roberts' calm demeanor, even he couldn't shake the feeling of dread that seemed to emanate from the hill. They pressed on, the dense foliage giving way to a rocky path that led higher up the slope. As they ascended, the temperature seemed to drop, a biting cold that seeped into their bones despite the tropical heat. The mist began to roll in, shrouding the hill in a thick fog that limited visibility to just a few feet ahead. "We're almost there," Harrison said, though he couldn't tell if it was meant to reassure the others or himself. Suddenly, Turner stumbled over something protruding from the ground. He looked down and saw what appeared to be an old, withered piece of cloth, half buried in the dirt. When he reached down to pull it free, he uncovered something that made his heart stop. A human skull, its empty eye sockets staring back at him. "Jesus Christ," Turner gasped, recoiling in horror. The others rushed over, their expressions hardening as they realized what Turner had found. It wasn't just a single skull scattered around. The area were more bones, remnants of a long-forgotten battle. "This must be one of the old French outposts," Davis said grimly. "They fought here during the First Indochina War. Never heard anything good about those battles." Carter knelt beside the remains, a look of unease on his face. "These men, they didn't just die in battle. Something else happened here." Before anyone could respond, a distant wail echoed through the fog, a sound so chilling that it froze the blood in their veins. It was a scream, but not of any living creature, a long, agonized cry that seemed to come from the very heart of the hill. "That's no animal," Roberts said, his voice barely a whisper. "Move out," Harrison ordered, his voice tense with urgency. "We're getting off this hill, now." As they began their retreat, The scream echoed again, louder this time, reverberating through the trees. The men moved faster, their nerves frayed, as the fog thickened around them, making it difficult to see even a few feet ahead. Suddenly, they were enveloped in the mist, and the trail they had followed seemed to vanish, leaving them disoriented and lost in the ghostly white shroud. The screams grew closer, more intense, as if whatever was making them was circling them, drawing nearer with each passing second. Panic set in as the squad tried to regroup, but the mist played tricks on their minds, warping the landscape and making it impossible to find their way. The once organized retreat became a desperate scramble to escape the unseen terror that stalked them. "Stick together," Harrison shouted, trying to maintain control, but his voice was swallowed by the mist. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the screaming stopped. An eerie silence fell over the hill once more, broken only by the ragged breaths of the soldiers. They were alone in the mist, surrounded by the remains of those who had perished before them, and the haunting realization that whatever haunted the screaming hill was not finished with them yet. The mist was suffocating, its cold tendrils wrapping around the soldiers like a living entity. They moved slowly through the fog, every step careful and deliberate, as if the ground beneath them might give way at any moment. The wailing screams had stopped, but the silence that followed was almost worse, a silence so profound it felt as though the world itself had died. Sergeant Harrison signaled for the squad to halt. The unease in his gut had only grown stronger, and he needed to get his bearings. "Hold up," he whispered, though his voice barely carried in the dense fog. "We need to figure out where we are." Private Turner, still shaken from the discovery of the skulls, glanced nervously at the others. "Sarge, this fog, it doesn't feel natural. It's like it's trying to keep us here." Corporal Davis, ever the pragmatist, was scanning the surrounding mist with his rifle raised, trying to pierce the thick veil. "Something's not right," he muttered. "This kind of fog shouldn't be this dense, especially not this high up. It's like we walked into another world." Private Carter, usually the most vocal about his superstitions, had gone quiet, his eyes wide with fear. He clutched his dog tags tightly, whispering a prayer under his breath. "We shouldn't have come here. This place is cursed." Those screams, those were the souls of the damned. Lieutenant Roberts, trying to keep his composure, looked back at Harrison. "We need to find a way down, regroup with the rest of the unit. This mist is playing tricks on our minds." Harrison nodded, though he was beginning to feel the same creeping dread. "Let's keep moving. Stay close, and keep your eyes sharp." They resumed their slow march through the fog, each man tense, waiting for anything to happen. The fog seemed to swirl around them, thickening and thinning as if it were alive, deliberately obscuring their path and disorienting them further. The sounds of the jungle, which had been absent, began to return, but distorted and twisted, like echoes from a nightmare. Then, from somewhere deep within the fog, a whispering voice floated to them. It was faint at first, barely discernible from the rustling leaves and creaking branches, but it grew louder, more insistent, until the men could no longer ignore it. Turn back, Private Turner froze, his eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that? Please tell me you heard that?" Harrison clenched his jaw, trying to push the fear aside. "I heard it. Stay calm, everyone. It's just the wind, probably carrying sounds from the jungle." But deep down, he knew it wasn't the wind. There was something in the fog, something that was toying with them, leading them deeper into the heart of the hill. As they continued, the whispering voices multiplied, overlapping and intertwining, creating a cacophony of unsettling sounds. Some voices pleaded, some mocked, and others screamed in agony. The men began to feel the weight of every step, as if the very ground beneath them resisted their advance. Private Carter, unable to take the pressure any longer, suddenly stopped and pointed to the fog ahead. "There, did you see that?" The squad turned their attention to where Carter was pointing, and for a brief moment, they saw it to a dark figure, barely visible through the mist, standing motionless and watching them. "Who's there?" Roberts demanded, his voice steady but filled with tension. The figure did not respond. It simply stood there, an ominous silhouette in the fog, until it slowly faded away, leaving only the whispering voices behind. "Keep moving," Harrison ordered, though he could feel the fear gnawing at him. "We have to keep moving," but the hill seemed to have other plans. No matter which direction they took, the fog grew thicker, the whispers louder, and the sense of dread more overwhelming. It was as if the hill itself was alive, shifting and changing to trap them, to ensure they would never leave. Then, out of the mist, they stumbled upon something that made their blood run cold. It was an old, decrepit hut, half collapsed and covered in vines. The wood was rotten, and the roof had caved in long ago, but there was something about it that was deeply unsettling. "We should check it out," Davis suggested, though he sounded as though he was trying to convince himself as much as the others. "Stay alert," Harrison replied, as he led the squad closer. As they approached, the whispers intensified, now clearer than ever. They weren't just whispers anymore, they were voices, speaking in broken Vietnamese and heavily accented English. The voices recounted tales of battles long lost, of men who had vanished into the mist, never to be seen again. It was as if the hut was a beacon for the souls that had perished on the hill, a place where their last moments were eternally replayed. Harrison motioned for the men to spread out and search the area. Turner, still visibly shaken, was hesitant but followed orders, keeping his rifle at the ready. As he neared the entrance to the hut, he saw something that made his breath catch in his throat, a set of footprints leading into the hut, but none leading out. "Sergeant, there's someone in there," Turner stammered, pointing at the footprints. Harrison nodded, signaling Davis to take the lead. The corporal cautiously stepped through the doorway, his rifle raised. Inside, the air was cold, unnaturally so, and the smell of decay was thick. The interior was sparse, with only a few remnants of what might have once been a living space: a rusted lantern, a broken chair, and a rotting wooden table. But then they saw a figure sitting in the corner, slumped over as if asleep. Davis approached cautiously, his finger on the trigger. But as he drew closer, the figure's head slowly lifted. It was a man, or rather, what was left of one. His skin was pale and withered, his eyes sunken and lifeless, and his mouth hung open in a silent scream. He looked as though he had been there for decades, untouched by time, a ghostly remnant of a forgotten war. And then, in a voice that was both a whisper and a scream, the figure spoke. "Why did you come here? You cannot leave." The words sent a chill through the squad, and before they could react, the figure began to dissolve into the mist, leaving behind only the echo of his final words. Panic surged through the group. "We need to get out of here," Turner yelled, his voice cracking. But as they turned to leave, the fog outside the hut thickened even further, swallowing the path they had come from. The whispers turned into a roar, and the once faint voices now screamed in unison, filling the air with a deafening noise that made the men cover their ears in agony. Harrison tried to rally the squad, but his voice was lost in the cacophony. The fog closed in around them, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to shift, pulling them deeper into the hill's grasp. Just as it seemed they would be lost forever, the roaring stopped. The fog thinned, and the men found themselves standing at the edge of the hill, the path ahead clear once more. They didn't question their luck. Without a word, they began their descent, eager to leave the cursed hill behind. But the whispers still echoed in their minds, and the memory of the ghostly figure in the hut haunted them as they hurried through the jungle, knowing that the screaming hill would never truly let them go. The squad moved quickly, driven by fear and desperation as the first light of dawn struggled to penetrate the thick jungle canopy. They had managed to escape the worst of the fog, but the oppressive atmosphere of the hill clung to them, its dark tendrils wrapping around their minds and souls. Sergeant Harrison led the way, his senses on high alert. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves, sent a jolt of fear through him. The jungle was alive with sounds, but none of them were natural. The whispers had faded, but the echoes of them lingered in the back of his mind, relentless and maddening. "We need to keep moving," Harrison urged, glancing back at his men. They were exhausted, their faces pale and eyes wide with fear, but they pushed on, knowing that stopping was not an option. "We have to get back to the main trail before nightfall." Private Turner, his rifle clutched tightly in his hands, kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting the fog to come rushing back at any moment. "Sarge, what if we're going in circles? What if the hill won't let us leave?" Harrison didn't have an answer. He had been trying to navigate using his compass, but even that seemed unreliable, the needle spinning erratically whenever they neared certain parts of the hill. "Just keep your focus, Turner. We'll find our way out." Corporal Davis, who had taken point with Harrison, suddenly stopped, raising his hand to signal the others to halt. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice tense. The squad froze, straining to listen. At first, all they could hear was the rustling of the jungle, the distant call of birds. But then, faintly, there it was, the sound of footsteps, echoing through the trees. "It's following us," Private Carter whispered, his voice trembling. "Whatever it is, it's following us." The footsteps grew louder, closer, but no matter where they looked, they couldn't see the source. It was as if the sound was coming from all around them, from the very earth beneath their feet. "Stay together," Lieutenant Roberts ordered, his voice calm but firm. "Whatever it is, we face it as a team." But the footsteps continued, relentless and mocking, leading them deeper into the jungle, away from the path they were trying to follow. The squad moved faster, their hearts pounding, but the sound only grew louder, more insistent, as if the very ground beneath them was alive and chasing them. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped, and for a moment, the jungle was eerily silent. The men exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to do next. Then, without warning, a blood-curdling scream erupted from the trees, echoing off the hillsides and sending a wave of terror through the squad. It was a scream of pure agony, as if someone or something was being tortured beyond comprehension. Private Turner stumbled back, his face pale. "What was that? Who was that?" "It wasn't human," Davis said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That scream, it wasn't human." Harrison forced himself to stay calm. "We can't let it get to us. It's just trying to scare us, to make us panic." But the scream had done its job. The men were on edge, their nerves frayed, and as they continued deeper into the jungle, the sense of dread only grew stronger. The path ahead seemed endless, the trees closing in around them like a cage. As they pushed forward, the jungle began to change. The vibrant greens and browns of the forest floor turned to shades of gray, and the air grew colder, heavier. The once familiar sounds of the jungle faded, replaced by an eerie stillness. Then they saw a large, moss-covered stone altar, half buried in the earth, standing in the middle of a small clearing. The altar was ancient, its surface worn smooth by time, and it was surrounded by a circle of twisted, gnarled trees. "What the hell is this?" Carter whispered, his eyes wide with fear. "This place, it's wrong." Harrison approached the altar cautiously, feeling an unnatural pull towards it. As he drew closer, he noticed symbols carved into the stone, symbols he didn't recognize, but that filled him with an overwhelming sense of dread. "These aren't Vietnamese," Roberts observed, examining the carvings. "They're much older, ancient." Davis scanned the tree line, his rifle ready. "This place feels like a trap. We shouldn't stay here." But it was too late. As the squad stood in the clearing, the fog began to return, seeping out from the trees like a living entity. The air grew colder, and the whispers started up again, louder this time, more insistent. "We need to get out of here," Harrison ordered, his voice tense. Now, but the fog was too thick, too fast. It closed in around them, and with it came the shadows, dark, indistinct figures that moved through the mist with unnatural speed. "Stay together," Robert shouted, but the men were already panicking, firing their rifles into the fog at the shadows that seemed to surround them. The shadows darted in and out of the mist, their forms shifting and changing, always just out of reach. The squad's bullets passed through them harmlessly, as if they were made of smoke. Then, out of the fog, came another scream, this one louder, more powerful, and filled with rage. It was followed by the sound of something massive crashing through the trees, heading straight for them. "Fall back," Harrison yelled, trying to regain control of the situation, but the fog was too thick, the shadows too numerous. The squad was scattered, lost in the mist, and the sense of dread that had been building since they entered the hill now threatened to overwhelm them completely. Turner, separated from the others, stumbled through the fog, his heart racing. He could hear the others shouting, but their voices seemed distant, as if they were miles away. The shadows continued to pursue him, whispering his name, taunting him. And then, just when he thought he couldn't take it anymore, he broke through the fog and found himself at the edge of the hill. Below him, the jungle stretched out, dark and foreboding, but the fog didn't seem to reach this far. He collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath, but the relief was short-lived. From behind him, he could still hear the echoes of the screams, the relentless footsteps, and the whispers that haunted his every step. He knew then that they weren't out of danger, not yet. The screaming hill wasn't done with them, not by a long shot. The fog clung to the ground like a living entity, thick and oppressive, distorting the landscape and muting the sounds of the jungle. Sergeant Harrison struggled to keep his bearings as he moved through the mist, the faint echoes of gunfire and shouting growing more distant with each passing moment. His men were scattered, and the hill seemed determined to swallow them whole. "Turner, Davis," he called out, his voice strained with worrying. "Report your position." But only silence greeted him, broken occasionally by the unnatural rustling of leaves and the soft, eerie whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Harrison's heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears like the drumbeat of impending doom. He knew he had to find his men before the hill claimed them completely. The fog was disorienting, but it wasn't impenetrable. He focused on the sounds. He could hear footsteps, distant cries, and the subtle rustle of movement nearby. Harrison moved cautiously, his rifle at the ready. The air grew colder with each step, the chill seeping into his bones, making him shiver despite the tropical climate. As he pushed forward, the mist began to thin slightly, revealing the twisted silhouettes of trees and rocks scattered across the landscape. And then he saw a shadowy figure moving through the fog, just ahead of him. Harrison's pulse quickened, hope flaring in his chest. "Davis," he called out, moving closer. "Is that you?" The figure stopped and turned slowly to face him, but something was wrong. The way it moved, the way it stood, it wasn't human. Harrison felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the figure was taller than any man he'd ever seen, its limbs elongated and its movements unnaturally fluid. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. The figure remained still, its face obscured by the shadows, but Harrison could feel its eyes on him, cold and calculating. For a moment, they stood there, locked in a silent standoff. Then, without warning, the figure lunged forward, moving with a speed and grace that defied logic. Harrison barely had time to react, raising his rifle and firing a burst of shots into the mist. The figure dissolved into the fog, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared, leaving Harrison alone once more. His hands trembled as he lowered his weapon, trying to steady his breathing. He knew that, whatever was out there, it wasn't something he could fight with bullets. It was something far older, far darker, than anything he'd ever encountered. As Harrison continued his search, he heard a low, mournful wail echoing through the trees. The sound was faint at first, but it grew louder, more insistent, as if the very hill itself was crying out in pain. He followed the sound, his instincts screaming at him to turn back, but he couldn't leave his men behind. The wail led him to a small clearing, where the fog parted to reveal an ancient, gnarled tree at its center. Its twisted branches reached up to the sky like skeletal fingers, and its bark was blackened and scarred. At the base of the tree, Harrison saw something that made his blood run cold to bodies, sprawled out on the ground, their faces twisted in agony. He recognized them immediately: Private Carter and Corporal Davis. "No," Harrison whispered, rushing to their side. But as he knelt beside them, he realized with a sickening lurch that something was horribly wrong. Their bodies were cold to the touch, their skin pale and lifeless. But it wasn't just that they were dead, it was the way they were positioned, their limbs contorted in unnatural angles, as if they had died in the throes of unimaginable pain. Harrison's mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. He had been with them just minutes ago. How could they be dead now? And what had done this to them? Before he could process any further, a voice spoke behind him, low and trembling. "Sarge." Harrison spun around, his heart pounding. Private Turner stood at the edge of the clearing, his face pale and eyes wide with terror. He looked like he had seen a ghost. "Turner." Harrison called out, relief flooding his voice. "Thank God, you're alive." But Turner didn't move. He just stared at the bodies, his hands trembling. "Sarge, they're not dead." Harrison frowned, glancing back at the corpses. "What are you talking about? They're not dead." Turner interrupted, his voice rising in panic. They're cursed." As if on cue, the air around them grew colder, and the bodies began to twitch, their limbs jerking unnaturally. Harrison watched in horror as Davis's eyes snapped open, glowing with an unnatural light. "Sarge," Davis rasped, his voice distorted and filled with malice. "Why did you leave us?" Harrison stumbled back, his mind reeling. This couldn't be happening, it wasn't possible. But as Carter's body began to move as well, rising from the ground with a grotesque grace, Harrison knew they were no longer his men. They were something else now, something twisted and evil, brought back by the cursed hill. "We were waiting for you," Carter said, his voice echoing with the same unnatural distortion. "Join us, Sarge, join us in the darkness." Harrison raised his rifle, his hands shaking. He didn't want to shoot, didn't want to harm the men he had sworn to protect, but he knew they were no longer human. They were something far worse, creatures born of the hill's malevolent power. Before he could pull the trigger, the fog thickened around him, and the whispers grew louder, filling his mind with a cacophony of voices. He could feel the presence of the hill closing in on him, its dark power suffocating him, pulling him into its grasp. "Sarge," Turner's voice cut through the fog, desperate and pleading. "We have to go, now." Harrison snapped out of his daze, lowering his rifle and grabbing Turner's arm. "Run," he shouted, pulling the young soldier with him as they fled the clearing. Behind them, the twisted figures of Davis and Carter watched with cold, dead eyes, their mouths curling into unnatural smiles. The hill wasn't done with them yet, it was only just beginning. The jungle seemed to close in around them as Harrison and Turner fled deeper into the mist-shrouded terrain. Every step was an ordeal, the thick foliage tearing at their fatigues, and the oppressive fog pressing down on them like a physical weight. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the low, haunting wails that echoed through the trees seemed to come from the very ground beneath their feet. Harrison's mind raced as he led Turner through the underbrush. The horrors they had just witnessed were playing in his thoughts. The sight of Davis and Carter, once his comrades, now twisted into monstrous forms by the malevolent forces of the hill, had shaken him to his core. He knew they were no longer men, but something far worse, and the knowledge gnawed at his sanity. "We can't stop," Harrison panted, his voice raw from shouting. "We have to keep moving." Turner nodded wordlessly, his eyes wide with terror. The young soldier was pale, his hands trembling as he clutched his rifle. He had seen too much, and the fear was eating away at him, threatening to consume him entirely. As they pushed deeper into the jungle, the mist grew thicker, the trees taller and more twisted. The terrain became increasingly difficult to navigate, the ground sloping downward into a narrow, winding ravine. The deeper they descended, the darker it became, until the daylight was reduced to a dim, sickly glow filtering through the canopy above. Harrison's instincts screamed at him to turn back, but there was no going back, not with Davis and Carter lurking somewhere in the fog. The only way out was forward, deeper into the unknown. The ravine soon opened up into a small, shadowy clearing, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. The only sounds were the distant echoes of the jungle and the ragged breathing of the two soldiers. "Where are we?" Turner whispered, his voice barely audible. Harrison scanned the area, his senses on high alert. "I don't know," he admitted. "But we need to find higher ground, somewhere we can get a signal." As they moved cautiously through the clearing, something caught Harrison's eye, a faint glimmer of light in the distance, flickering like a dying flame. It was barely visible through the thick fog, but it was there, beckoning them like a beacon in the darkness. "Do you see that?" Turner asked, his voice tinged with hope. Harrison nodded. "Stay close," he ordered, leading the way toward the light. The ground beneath their feet grew uneven, littered with roots and rocks that threatened to trip them with every step. But they pressed on, drawn toward the light like moths to a flame. As they neared the source, the light grew brighter, revealing the outlines of what appeared to be a small, dilapidated structure, an old, abandoned shack, half hidden by the encroaching jungle. Harrison approached the shack cautiously, his rifle raised. The structure was ancient, its wooden walls rotted and covered in moss. The door hung loosely on its hinges, creaking softly in the wind. The flickering light was coming from inside, casting eerie shadows on the ground. "We should check it out," Harrison said, though his gut told him this was a terrible idea. Turner hesitated, fear etched on his face. "What if it's one of them?" Harrison clenched his jaw. "We'll find out," he said grimly. With a deep breath, Harrison pushed the door open with the barrel of his rifle, the rusty hinges groaning in protest. The inside of the shack was even more dilapidated than the exterior. Broken furniture lay scattered across the dirt floor, and the walls were covered in strange, indecipherable symbols carved into the wood. But what drew their attention was the source of the light, a small, flickering candle placed in the center of the room, its flame dancing erratically. It was an odd sight, out of place in the middle of the jungle, and it filled Harrison with a sense of unease. "Who would light a candle out here?" Turner whispered, his voice trembling. Harrison didn't answer. He was too busy studying the room, trying to make sense of the symbols carved into the walls. They looked ancient, almost tribal, but there was something malevolent about them, something that made his skin crawl. As they stood there, the air grew colder, and the fog outside seemed to press against the walls of the shack, as if trying to seep inside. The candle flickered more violently, its flame shrinking and growing in quick succession. Suddenly, the temperature in the room plummeted, and the candle's flame was snuffed out, plunging them into darkness. Turner gasped, and Harrison immediately raised his rifle, his heart pounding in his chest. "Stay close," he ordered, his voice barely above a whisper. But as the darkness closed in around them, they both felt it, a presence in the room, something watching them, something malevolent. The air was thick with it, and the symbols on the walls seemed to pulse with a faint, sickly glow. "Who's there?" Harrison demanded, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a low, guttural voice echoed through the shack, a voice that didn't belong to any living thing. "You cannot escape the hill." The words sent a chill down Harrison's spine. He couldn't see the source of the voice, but he could feel it. Something was in the room with them, something ancient and evil, drawn to them by the hill's dark power. "Turner, we need to," Harrison began, but before he could finish, the ground beneath their feet began to shake violently, and the walls of the shack groaned as if they were about to collapse. "Run," Harrison shouted, grabbing Turner and pulling him toward the door. They burst out of the shack and into the fog, the ground still trembling beneath them. The ravine echoed with the sounds of cracking wood and falling debris as the shack collapsed behind them, swallowed by the earth. But there was no time to look back. Harrison and Turner ran blindly through the fog, the malevolent presence chasing them, whispering dark promises in their ears. The jungle seemed to twist and warp around them, the trees closing in, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The fog grew thicker, obscuring everything except for the faint glow of the symbols, now etched into the very air around them. Harrison's breath came in ragged gasps as he pushed onward, desperate to escape the hill's grasp. But deep down, he knew the truth: there was no escaping the screaming hill. It had them in its grip, and it wasn't going to let go. As they ran, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling their minds with visions of death and despair. The ground beneath them seemed to shift and twist, pulling them deeper into the hill's embrace. Then, as if from nowhere, they emerged from the fog into another clearing, a dead end, surrounded by towering cliffs that rose up on all sides. Harrison skidded to a stop, his eyes wide with horror. "No," he muttered, his voice trembling. "This can't be happening." Turner was panting heavily, his face pale with fear. "What do we do now, Sarge?" Harrison didn't answer. He was staring at the cliffs, his mind racing. There was no way out, no escape. The hill had led them here, trapped them like rats in a maze. The whispers grew louder, more mocking, as if the hill itself was laughing at their despair. And then, from the darkness, the shadowy figures began to emerge, twisted, cursed beings, once human, now something far worse. Davis and Carter were among them, their eyes glowing with that same unnatural light, their twisted smiles etched with malice. They moved toward Harrison and Turner slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the moment. "You can't escape," Davis rasped, his voice filled with dark satisfaction. "The hill has claimed you." Harrison backed away, his rifle trembling in his hands. He knew they couldn't fight them. These were no longer his men. They were something else, something far more powerful and evil. Turner was shaking, tears streaming down his face. "Sarge, I don't want to die here." Harrison's mind raced, searching for a way out, but there was none. They were surrounded, outnumbered, and the hill's power was too strong. But as the cursed soldiers closed in, something deep within Harrison stirred, a fierce, unyielding will to survive. He couldn't give up, not here, not like this. "Stay close," Harrison ordered, his voice firm, despite the fear clawing at him. "We're not done yet." With that, he raised his rifle, aiming it at the nearest figure, and opened fire. The final night on the accursed hill had arrived. The soldiers were exhausted, both mentally and physically, yet the air around them felt unnaturally still, as if nature itself was holding its breath. No rustling leaves, no chirping insects, only an oppressive silence that seemed to thicken with every passing moment. Phil, John, and the remaining members of their team were acutely aware that something was wrong. They could feel it in their bones, a deep, unsettling dread that was impossible to shake. As they set up camp on the hilltop, each man glanced nervously into the surrounding darkness, haunted by the sounds that had plagued them over the past few nights. As the last traces of daylight faded, the silence was shattered by a blood-curdling scream, a sound they had come to know all too well. This time, however, the scream was different. It was closer, clearer, and filled with a terrifying mix of rage and agony. The soldiers froze, their hearts pounding in their chests as the scream echoed through the trees, reverberating across the hill. John, his voice trembling, finally broke the silence. "This isn't normal. We need to either get out of here or stand our ground." Phil, struggling to maintain his composure, ordered everyone to prepare for whatever might come. But as they scrambled to arm themselves, a thick fog began to roll in, swallowing the camp in a matter of minutes. The fog was so dense that they could barely see their hands in front of their faces, and within it, they started to see shadowy figures moving. Panic spread quickly among the men. They fired their weapons into the fog, but their bullets seemed to hit nothing but air. It was as if the fog itself was absorbing the shots, mocking their attempts to defend themselves. The fog thickened, and with it came the unmistakable sound of laughter, a chilling, high-pitched cackle that grated against their nerves. "We need to move. Now," Phil shouted, his voice barely cutting through the growing hysteria. He began to run, urging the others to follow, but the fog made it impossible to see where he was going. The group splintered, each man stumbling through the fog, disoriented and terrified. Phil's heart raced as he pushed through the mist, desperate to find a way out. But the more he ran, the more he felt like he was being watched. Every now and then, he would catch glimpses of the soldiers who had once fought on this hill, ghostly figures, their faces twisted in sorrow and anger. These were not just echoes of the past. They were trapped, doomed to relive their final moments on this cursed land. He fell to the ground, his legs giving out from exhaustion and fear. Around him, the screams of his comrades faded one by one, swallowed by the fog. Phil was alone, surrounded by the dead. He could feel their eyes on him, their cold breath on his neck. When he looked up, he saw them clearly, dozens of ghostly soldiers standing in a silent circle around him, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity and hatred. Phil understood in that moment that the hill had claimed them all. This was no ordinary battlefield, it was a place of eternal torment, a vortex that consumed the living and the dead alike. When the morning came, a rescue team arrived on the hill, but what they found was chilling. There were no survivors, only signs of a fierce struggle and scattered equipment. The hill was eerily quiet, and though the searchers tried to dismiss it, they couldn't ignore the faint echoes of screams and laughter that still lingered in the air. The team of soldiers, including Phil and John, had vanished without a trace, leaving only the terrifying memory of that final night on the Screaming Hill. The hill was quickly deemed a no-go zone, its dark legend growing with each retelling. If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel, Mystical Tales, so you won't miss out on more eerie and thrilling tales in the future. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.